All right, welcome back to History of Photography. This is week 2 and our first lecture. Those of you who were with us last week, the first day of class, will know that this is the first time that we're doing this whole class virtually, completely online. So I ask that you bear with me while I'm learning how to do the Blackboard for this class. I've mostly got it figured out, but there'll be some hiccups here and there, I'm sure. But we're in this together, and we will do our best throughout the entire term. So this week, we are going to start at the beginning, actually before the beginning, because we have to figure out how we got to photography before we can talk about photography. So those of you who have had some photography background or have gotten a head start and jumped into your textbook already, you'll know what image this is on the screen here. This is the first permanent photograph. We will go more into depth about the significance of this later, as well as the significance of the word permanent, but I always feel like this is a good image to start with since it's our first permanent photograph. So the origins of photography leading up to photography. There are some very basic ingredients to photography, right? We have a light-tight box, lenses, and light-sensitive substances like chemicals. Now, those three things are more relevant to photography pre-digital photography, but the same basic principles apply to your digital cameras. They're all built on the foundation of these sort of basic ingredients that started photography. Now, all of these ingredients had been known for hundreds of years before photography was actually invented, but it would take a long time for folks to figure out the right combination of these ingredients to make photography happen. So a little story for you. Early in the 16th century, in Italy and France, they would put a small hole in the roof of the cathedrals, and this hole would act as a lens that would then focus the image of the sun down on the floor below. They would record the sun's movements so that they could establish the modern calendar, the one we still use today. And you're probably wondering, well, why is she telling us about holes in cathedrals? What does that have to do with photography? I will tell you. If someone had placed a polished silver plate on the floor of those cathedrals to see if the image of the sun would register, then they might have discovered photography much earlier than the 19th century or the 1800s. The reason behind that will sort of become clear as we go through the different methods of photography during its development, but essentially, those of you who've ever had any silver jewelry will know that silver reacts to light. It tarnishes, right? So when it's treated with other chemicals, it has the ability to register an image on it. Again, we'll go into that more later. So all of these ingredients exist, but no one's really, interested in pursuing anything like photography because no one had really thought about it before. Other technologies, for example, airplanes and cars, were imagined long before they were actually invented. What I mean by that is folks would write in imaginative literature and stories about flying machines or about a mode of transportation that had wheels that could rapidly take you from one point to the next, respectively, airplanes and cars. So you see a lot of that similarly in the 20th century before we even go to the moon, right? Before man lands on the moon, before we're even thinking about how to get on the moon, there's a lot of early science fiction writing about space travel. So even something like that is imagined and written about. Photography was not imagined beforehand. There's very little, if any, literature about someone imagining making an image from life outside of what they already know as like paintings and drawings and things like that. You know, you could think of it as like a mirror of life, but no one had written about it, no one had thought about it. So it really does seem to have this very abrupt appearance in history. Like, boom, all of a sudden it's there. And, you know, that has a lot to do with everything that kind of led up to photography that we're going to get into now. So we're going to start by talking about what was happening before photography so that we can situate ourselves within this time period and get an understanding of the foundation. So before photography came on the scene, the world relied very heavily on painters to create naturalistic depictions of the world. By the mid-1830s, these painters were very focused on what we would call rendering a mundane reality. So what I mean by that is, for example, this painting in this slide here, there's nothing very extra special about it. Not that the painting isn't good or that it isn't special because it's a painting, but the imagery itself is very simple. It's very clear, it's very basic. It's an image of a small town. There's a path, there's a person on a horse, trees, some clouds in the sky, etc. It's a very realistic representation of this town. Because our culture today places such value on imaginative art, we sometimes forget that back in the day, the most common use for paintings and other printmaking methods was to copy exactly what was seen around them or to illustrate what was told in stories without inserting one's own perspective or creativity on the scene. In short, today it's more about self-expression, and historically these images, these paintings were for records and for documentation, and also decoration if you were wealthy enough to be able to commission an artist to put works in your home. So this would be the only way that you could see what another place looked like. There's no internet, there's no Google, there's really not accessible libraries, museums are not very accessible. So if you were lucky enough to be able to go somewhere that had these paintings, that would be the way that you saw them. And even the very wealthy who had these types of paintings in their homes, it was decoration, yes, but also representation of the world around them, of their wealth and status. Even engraving, which is a printmaking process that allowed the artist to make multiple prints from one plate, was expected to very faithfully copy things like historical monuments, machines, new mechanical devices or inventions, animals, plants, and even other works of art like sculptures or paintings. So before we dive into engraving itself, a painting is singular. There is one of them historically because there's no way to reproduce them. If you're a very well-commissioned artist or painter that has funding from a government or other support system within the country that you live in, you might be able to afford to have apprentices that can recreate your paintings, basically make identical facsimiles in the same material. It's painstaking work, and it didn't happen that often because there was something to be said for having only one of this painting. So the way that one might share that singular painting with a wider audience is to translate it into an engraving. And engravings could make endless copies. So then you could make as many copies as you want. You could disseminate them as posters in publications, whether it's a newspaper, mail them to other parts of the world. It was had a little bit more global reach at that time. So this particular engraving here is an engraving by Albrecht Dürer from 1514, so 16th century. We're going back in time here. And this one isn't necessarily like a depiction of everyday life. There are other uses for these types of printmaking methods at that time, which could be to stand alone and tell a story. They might be part of a series that tells a story, or they might be illustrating something from literature or the Bible or any sort of religious texts, mythology, those kind of things. So that would be more so what we're looking at here. And this engraving by Mr. Durer is one of his most famous. He's also one of the most famous engraving artists ever to have lived. And we're not going to dive too much into dissecting what's happening in this actual print here, because this is the history of photography and not the history of printmaking, despite how fascinating the history of printmaking actually is. But just to give you an idea of how we should be approaching the way we look at images and see images and explore images, almost every image we're going to look at in this class, whether it's an engraving like this or a photograph, which mostly, obviously, they'll be photographs, every single item within the frame is placed there with purpose. Nothing is just sort of willy-nilly tossed in there because, oh, it happened to be around, or, you know, it just looked good there. This particular engraving has a lot of layers of meaning and symbolism that are brought in. You can kind of see there's a lot going on here. There's an hourglass representing time. There are scales representing balance. There's something that looks like a calendar, but it's actually something called a magic square. You know, there's the individual sitting there with wings indicating that they're a higher being. So you can see, as you sort of go through this image, you can unpack each piece. And that's kind of a fun way to explore images, is to go through it piece by piece and write down, like, okay, this is in here, this is in here, this is in here. You know, we have the hourglass, we have the scales, we have the cherub, we have the what looks like a dog, I think. There's a ball, all kinds of different things. Pull out every single item that you see and then write down what you think its size is. And then, of course, if you want to go on Google and dive really deep into this kind of stuff, you can start Googling different symbolism for these different items. And then once you kind of have all your symbols pulled out, you can sort of start to address the deeper meaning behind some of these images. Now, I don't expect you to do it with this engraving, but this one in particular has a lot of lore about it. So if you wanted to get a good starting point, this one is kind of a good way to dig into a very close reading of an engraving. So we have to look at what engraving is so that you guys understand the artistic process behind it. Because I think when most of us think about engraving, we think like, oh yeah, my mom engraved my initials on the back of my watch, or you might have an ID bracelet that has your name engraved on it. And that is engraving, but that's not the same kind of engraving that is this printmaking process. So I have a video that's going to kind of show you what the engraving process looks like. And you'll have to bear with me because I have to go out of the slideshow to the video panel to show this with you. So I'll talk myself through this. We're going to stop well, no, I won't stop the share. I'm going to go back to the share and do share screen. And then we're going to pull up the video that we want to share. And unfortunately, I can't make this full screen because it won't show up in the slides. So we'll have to do it this sort of like theater style. But I did test the volume, so you should be able to hear everything that they're saying in this one. And so let's dive in and watch this master engraver show us kind of the basics of how that works here.
I'm Emily Peters, Associate Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the RISD Museum, and I'm here with Andrew Bradbury, who is a professor of printmaking at Rhode Island School of Design. And Andrew and I have been working on an exhibition together on the subject of Renaissance and Baroque engravings, and it's titled The Brilliant Line, Following the Early Modern Engraver, 1480 to 1650. To
trace it, and then I'm going to flip the tracing over so I can reverse it on the plate.
The drawing that Andrew chose is by Francesco Primaticcio. He made it in the 1540s when he was working in France. It's the kind of drawing that would have been used by an engraver, and Andrew made a copy after this drawing, and in doing so, he worked out some of the iconographic elements and the format, making it into an oval.
So I'm just going to finish it up. And I'm ready to remove the tracing from I'm going to melt a little bit of wax onto this plate. Spread it out. Wax is going to take an impression from the drawing, so I'm going to use the tracing and then trace through the tracing through the stylus. And that's going to leave the drawing on the plate just like they touched onto the wax. You can see the impression of the outlines into the wax, and I'll be able to follow those outlines with the drawing point tool and scratch those lines in to get a guideline for the whole process. So what I'm doing right now is I'm using this steel tool to scratch the lines in the plate. I'm following the lines I made with the wax, that are already pressed in the wax, and I'm scratching them in the plate with the tool. And what this is going to do is very, very pale outline that I can follow throughout the engraving process. So I'm ready to start engraving, and I'm going to place the plate onto this sand-filled pad, and that allows me to have a kind of pivoting action when I work the plate, because one of the principles of engraving, especially for curves, is that the plate is pushed and the tool is stationary. This is an engraving tool, it's called a burin, and it's this square steel shaft that's been inserted in this handle and polished and sharpened so that these three planes come to a perfect point. So I engage the tool in one of my dry pointed lines. And as I'm pushing the plate, a curl of copper is emerging. And that curl of copper is called the burr. When I get to the end of the line, I pull out the burin, and I take this tool called the scraper, and I use the scraper to cut off the burr. So once all the outlines have been laid in, I start to develop the forms with kinds of a certain kind of cross-hatching. And that's one of the most important interpretive acts of the engraver, is deciding on the various patterns that are going to be used in the cross-hatching. I think we're ready, right? We're in the etching area of the CIT, British Art University. And we have everything set up here to start building the plate. This is a dauber, and what it does is it forces the ink into the engraved lines. I'm just going to use a card to take off most of the excess ink.
So you can see why each impression of an engraving took so much work.
I'm going to use the tarlatan, which is a sifted cheesecloth, and start wiping the ink off the surface of the plate.
So the force of the printing press pulls the ink inside those insides lines.
So I've done as much as I can do with the rags, and I'm ready for the next stage, which is called hand wiping. And this picks up some of the plates on the palm of my hand. So I use a little bit of whiting, which is calcium carbonate. Andrew's been sitting in the bath, and that's allowed it to soften both the gelatin and the fibers of the paper. And now I'm just going to bring it over to the blotting area to get rid of some of the excess water that's in the paper.
course of that period.
And here we go. Pull back the blankets. And we're ready to remove the impression from the plate. You can see that the print is in reverse of the engraved image.
Therefore, in the same direction as the original drawing.
That's right.
It's clear and crisp. It's beautiful.
Okay, so that's sort of the basics of how engraving works. I'm going to come back now to our slideshow. Here, hold on a second. Okay, so that video is really helpful because it's not super long and you get the basic idea of how that works. But you can see how much labor goes into creating an engraving. So it's definitely not like making a Xerox copy, a photocopy today. It's not like taking a photograph. It definitely took a lot of skill, time, and effort. And even each print that you would pull, you would have to re-ink the plate. So for this time period, that was considered, you know, very revolutionary and great that you could make copies even though it took time. But it wasn't fast by any means. So again, it took a lot of work to get from the idea to the plate to the final print. But printmaking methods like this, aside from a few other methods I'm going to show you as well, was really the only method of reproducing an image multiple times before photography came on the scene. This is how you would make images for books, for newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, posters, advertisements, etc. That was the only way. Next, I want to show you another printmaking method, the woodcut. It's using, instead of using the copper plate like we saw Andrew using in that video, this one, like the name suggests, uses a block of wood, but it also allows you to make multiples from it. I think between this slide and the previous one, and I'm going to flip back and forth here now, you can kind of see the difference in how the line work is. This one has a lot of very, very tiny details. The woodcut, while detailed, is a little bit chunkier, and you can usually tell the difference between a woodcut and an engraving by the way the line work is done. The engravings are usually a little more precise, but of course you will have some master woodcutters who definitely rival the sort of technique that's used with engraving as well. Now, in this particular woodcut here, also by Albert Dürer, the title kind of gives it away, but if we hadn't seen the title, which says The Fall of Man, it's pretty clear that this is a very recognizable story. It's the story of Adam and Eve from you know, the religious stories. So you have the man and the woman, there's the serpent handing the apple, well, not handing because serpents don't have hands, but giving the apple to Eve, and then, you know, they're shown in the Garden of Eden there. So this is another example of how printmaking methods were used to illustrate popular stories throughout history. There's also a video about the woodcut here. It is similar to the engraving, but I think it's important to kind of see the difference. And this video is a little bit different of a type. So we will go, let's go see that video on the woodcut here. I'm going to go find that video. Make sure that I'm sharing here. Okay. And woodcuts can also be called relief printmaking, and they don't necessarily always have to be done on wood. They can be done on linoleum too, which is actually a really great beginner technique if you want to try this out, they sell sheets of linoleum, which is essentially the same thing that rubber stamps are made of, but you can buy linoleum at a craft store and the little cutting tool to cut into it, and then you can just roll some ink across it and make your own like stamps and stuff too. But anyway, I'm getting off the topic. Let's learn about the woodcut process of printmaking here.
There are several different types of prints which could fall underneath the hood of relief printmaking, but for the purposes of this video, I will focus specifically on woodcuts, my inspirations, process, and methods for making them as well. One of these said inspirations would be the wonderfully executed and rendered designs by Hans Holbein for his 1522 Dance of Death series. It is absolutely terrifying in fiction. You can see here the upper arm of Death is composed of two bones, indicating the relative lack of understanding of basic anatomy at the time. And here is the master of the Northern Renaissance, Albrecht Dürer, with his absolutely immaculate, unrivaled woodcuts of just such immense detail. Aside from his Christian depictions, he explored more classical motifs. I personally find his Martyrdom of 10,000 to be one of his crowning achievements. Not necessarily composition or balance, but just absolute sheer amount of detail compacted into just 11 by 15 inches. Another more relatively recent artist I admire is the wood engraver Paul Landecker, in his beautifully rendered and soft forms, largely composed of just straight lines. And it could be said that he, in some ways, popularized the method of wood engraving from a working man's art to a fine art form. Many of his compositions are full of beautiful light. Len Ward is another artist I admire. His terrifying Art Deco nightmares for his wordless, textless novels, or I guess it could be kind of a precursor to the modern day graphic novel. John J. Murphy had a really unique way of angular, stylized cutting that I find appealing too. Pierre Vibert was a French artist with another unique cutting style, a lot of vertical lines. With my own woodcutting work, I cut into MDF type of fiberboard, and the cutting process is fairly simple. What you cut away will be revealed once printed as the white of the paper showing through. And what you leave is the black, the line work, the actual image itself, which will be stamped into the paper, either through the etching press or printing it by hand. But for the demonstration of this video, I'll be printing with an etching press. The first step I do is I sketch out the image in pencil, and then I ink it in, preferably with India ink, because Charmy can kind of leave a purple iridescence, which kind of confuse my eye later on. And I darken the block with screen printing ink, so when I cut, the lighter value of the, as you see here, the MDF will show through, kind of allowing me to pre-visualize how the actual image will look on the paper. And you see here all the fine parallel lines that I'm making. I'm trying to stick with the curvature of the form below to not only indicate the value of the light hitting the branch in this case, but also the actual form and curvature of the surface of the object. So if you mix up the types of cuts that you do and the different techniques, you can kind of also visualize different textures and surfaces of light and atmospheric perspective and all these subtleties which are quite difficult to do in a woodcut but kind of provide an interesting challenge for me. And once the block is finished being cut, in this case, with this image is a couple weeks from the initial drawing, I will go through and make sure that all the fine lines have adequate valleys to make the actual inking process go a bit easier. And you see here I am spreading out some ink on some glass, which I will roll out with this brayer you see there. And you roll it out until it kind of reaches a nice fine consistency. You don't really want an orange peel finish, and you don't want it too thin. But listen to this bacon frying sound I've heard. And down into the valleys, kind of ink what's not supposed to be ink. So also border helps in this regard. And here's the finished block, and you can see everything is darkened. It's all caked up with thick black greasy ink. And then it's off to the etching press, and set the pressure to accommodate the size of the block, and then you can actually start the printing process. Before printing on nice paper, I like to proof the block initially just by printing with printer paper or some shitty newsprint or something, just to kind of get a good judgment of how the printing process is going to go. The blankets you see there ensure that the paper won't shift and kind of dampens and evens out the pressure. Pulling away the blankets, the first print I did on the newsprint turned out surprisingly well. The block was evenly inked, the pressure seemed to be set just about right, and I was confident after one or two more pulls on different types of lower grade paper to move on up to nicer toned printmaking paper, which BFK cream, or I'm not sure exactly what I was printing on here, but I put some registration marks down on the runner block, and using those as a guide to ensure that the print would be near the center of the paper, maybe not exactly, but close. Printing went pretty well. I think I got an addition of 20 or so out of this print, and they all printed fairly well. Some of the finer cuts were lost as they pooled ink and weren't really able to be retrieved by lightening the pressure or anything. And so it's kind of a balance between, do I lose certain lines or do I have kind of a salty, underinked print? But I kind of found a nice balance, and I got a usable addition out of it. And the final image wasn't exactly what I'd planned, but the majority of my complaints weren't with the actual printing process or my printing abilities, it's the actual cutting on my part. Not necessarily mistakes like slips or actual errors on the block, just poor judgments in cutting or things I wish I would have done differently. Another thing I've started doing recently is adapting the line work from these woodcuts into 4 or 5 color CMYK process screen prints, stochastic halftones, resulting in kind of full color visualizations of how I intended the woodcuts to be in my mind. The previous woodcut, which I've detailed in this video, is actually a continuation of a 2-part series of prints centered around a pond full of symbolic imagery and surrealistic details from nightmares and dreams I've had, also coupled with a love of traditional printmaking. Here's a Cicindela formosa tiger beetle. This is an auroch, which is the ancestor of modern-day cattle. It's a relatively small woodcut. It's a pretty big woodcut. It's about a 24-inch print, full sheet of a Pseudobis audax male jumping spider. More imagery, probably born out of my interest in artists like Hieronymus Bosch, Hans Holbein, and Rubel. Also, of course, there's elements I love natural history. This piece was making alongside Louis Wayne, potentially insane illustrator of cats, anthropomorphic cats. That's probably Gustave Doré. This will obviously be Hans Holbein knockoff in my style, which I adapted into a 4-color CMYK process screen print. The Jewish folklore character Lilith poisoning the water supply of a nearby town. Another thing I haven't really touched on is linoleum cuts are a bit softer if you're interested in relief printmaking, and they ink well and have a nice smooth surface, and without much pressure you can do nice prints, and also they lend themselves to production printmaking I've found quite well, and nice clean graphic cuts, kind of a challenge for me. So in conclusion to all this, here's another 2-color lino cut reduction I did of Megaloceros giganteus, the ill-fated Irish elk. So if you'd like to own a woodcut of your own, or just look at what I'm doing, head on over to thomasshahan.com. Thanks.
Okay, so that was the woodcut. Now, all right, let's get back to our slideshow here. So you heard him say in there that he got through an edition of 20 before he started to lose the detail. That is one downfall of the woodcut and the linoleum cut, or lino cut as it's sometimes called, as opposed to engraving. Engraving, you really aren't going to lose any detail because it's etched into that copper plate. It's not going anywhere. Wood has fibers, so it'll start to absorb the ink and you'll start to lose some of the details in there. So that's the basics of the woodcut. Again, I like that particular video because he does show a lot of his inspiration, which is, you know, a lot of historical printmakers, which is very similar to kind of how we're leading up to photography here. This is Albrecht Dürer. I just like to share sometimes the portraits of the folks that make these images, artworks that we're looking at. This is him. This is his self-portrait with a fur coat from 1500, and you can see obviously what he looks like. He has a fur coat, so that indicates some wealth there. But anyways, that's Mr. Dürer. So move on. This image here says engraving depicting artist at work. So today, if you wanted to document an artist working in their studio, you'd go in and snap a picture, likely with your phone, or if it's something more for a publication, then perhaps with your digital, very special digital camera. Historically, that wasn't an option. So if you wanted to show an artist working in their studio, you would have to make a drawing or an engraving of it. And there's something unique about this particular image, and you see that in front of the subject there's a big square, and hopefully you can see the lines crisscrossing through there. There's a grid in front of the subject. The artist also has a grid laid over their paper. And this is an apparatus that many artists would use in order to make sure that they had the most realistic representation of their subject, so that they weren't taking any creative liberties with how their subject looked, whether it was a portrait of an individual or a landscape or a still life, whatever you could possibly think of, they wanted to make it the most realistic. So as shown here, they would use two frames with grids on them that were either the same size or coordinated, so that the one the artist was using was to scale either larger or smaller than the one in front of their subject. Again, here they are using it for a portrait. Sometimes folks are like, oh, well, isn't that cheating? And it's like, well, not really, because it can be kind of overwhelming to have to address a blank canvas with no guidelines, and there's all different types of artists out there, right? So if you feel that you want to use a grid for it, that's useful for you, why not? It's not doing the drawing for you, it's really just breaking down the canvas into little squares so that you can focus on one square at a time. So depending on the way that you use the grid, you might start in the top corner and work your way to the bottom, or you could start in the middle. It's really up to you, whatever works. And then once you have all the lines drawn out, then this artist would likely turn this into a painting at some point. So again, it's not cheating, it's just a drawing aid, a drawing tool. And this is the first of several drawing aids that we're going to talk about now. Here's also, someone has it set up for a still life here. You can see that the paper they have in front of the grid is much smaller. So if you're using a large subject but a smaller piece of paper, then you have to figure out the ratio of the size of those squares in the grid for the subject to the ratio of the squares that you're going to use on your paper. Here is a big one that folks would take out for doing landscapes in real life, or plein air, that's the technical term. Albert Dürer would use the grid system for a lot of the drawings and sketches that he would create prior to working on copper or wood. And mostly, for a lot of folks, it's this subject of foreshortening that is difficult to render with your eye and your mind, because our mind thinks, like, if you're looking at the human body or if you have an understanding of your own body, your hand is usually not larger than your face. But if you're holding your hand out in front of you and someone's going to draw that and they want the drawing to look like your hand is sticking out, they're going to have to draw your hand larger than it is in relation to your face to get that appearance of perspective. You can kind of see it here in this slide where the legs of this subject are going to be much larger than the rest of the body to create that illusion of the subject lying down, so you can render the correct proportions in the drawing that you're going to make. Obviously, once we get photography, that's not an issue because the camera just does everything. But if you're going to do a drawing or a painting, you want to make sure that you have your perspective situated properly. The next drawing aid on our list is something called the pantograph. And this thing is really great because it's kind of a fun tool to use. So I still remember when I was in grade school, junior high, high school, we still had blackboards, chalkboards in the classrooms, and they had these pantographs made so that one end would hook onto the wall and the other parts of it you could trace a small picture and make it larger on the blackboard. It was really cool. But essentially the way this works, you can see here that there is an anchor. There's that gray circle, that's the anchor. And then there's a small picture, a photograph actually, and there's a stylus over that, and then there's a large piece of drawing paper and there's a Sharpie shown over there. Now obviously this is a more modern rendering of this. It's not, they didn't have Sharpies in the 1500s, but what you would do is you would hold the stylus and trace around that little image, and the sort of intersecting bars of the pantograph would then render the outline of the object that you're tracing on the larger sheet of paper. Alternatively, this could be inverted, and you could use a large image, put your stylus in the spot where that Sharpie is, and move your drawing tool over to the small part of it, and then you could shrink down an image from large to small. So this was an aid that drawers often used, or drawers, painters, printmakers would use when trying to increase or decrease the size of something as a foundation for building a drawing, print, or painting. The next thing we have is the Physionotrace, another drawing aid, pretty similar actually to the pantograph. You can actually see what looks like a pantograph hanging off of the back of this thing. And at first glance, everyone always thinks that this looks a lot like the guillotine, but it's not the guillotine, but it does look like one. But basically, it's this apparatus that's been set up so that the artist can use a pantograph to trace a shadow or a silhouette. So the subject would sit in the chair, and their head would be lit from behind. You see there's a candle in the background there. They would be lit from behind, and then their shadow would be thrown onto the sort of white screen there. And you see at the top there's a little piece of paper, and there would be a pencil in that smaller end of the pantograph that's attached to this apparatus here, which as a whole is called the Physionotrace. And then you can see there's like a weight and a stylus that you would use to trace the silhouette there. Of course, I have a video because sometimes it's much easier to see it than to try to imagine what's possibly happening by listening to me describe it to you. So here, let me go find our video for this. Share screen. You're going to get sick of me saying share screen, but I need to walk myself through this sometimes. So this is going to tell us all about these early drawing aids.
invention of photography was not one discovery that led to what we understand as photography today.
There are winners and losers in the evolution of photography.
It's so fascinating at every different point in its history. The way that we familiarize ourselves with the world around us just fundamentally changed with photography.
The silhouette really is the essence. That's the essence of a person's soul. And people knew that. The term photography in Greek is light drawing. So when you're drawing with light, you can do it with chemicals. But before photography, you would look at the shadow, you would trace the shadow. The problem with drawing a shadow with someone is that if you put a person in a room and you put a candle on one side of that person and it casts the shadow, it's a very big shadow. So the biggest problem is how do you take a very big shadow and make it into a little tiny shadow? So there are tools that they use. The pantograph machine that has these intersecting bars with a pencil, and you can trace the large object and it would make it into a very small object. There was an inventor by the name of Chrétien who invented a device that would trace the shadow of a person through a series of levers. It would then reduce the picture at the same time. This instrument is called a physionotrace.
The thing about the silhouette and the physionotrace that made them different from a painted portrait was that they were mechanical. They were much more objective portraits of individuals, unlike paintings, which were very subjective.
Camera obscura means dark room. That's all it is. It's a room with no light in it. And if you have a room with no light and you poke a little hole in the side of that room and you let light in from the outside, by miracle, you'll have an image projected upside down, turned around, but in color and moving on the other side of the wall.
It's a phenomenon that people have been aware of for thousands and thousands of years. It's easy to do. It's very often the first project that is taught in photography classes, just as a way to get people to understand the simplicity of what the camera is.
Later improvements of the camera obscura included putting a lens in the hole so that the light could be focused, so that you would have a brighter and more focused image that would be projected on the wall.
But for photography, the camera is essentially a box. The early experimenters with photography all knew that they wanted to make images in that box.
The story of the invention of photography builds on experiments after experiment.
Johann Heinrich Schulze is a German professor. And in the case of Schulze's experiment, what you have is a glass jar, and it's filled with chalk. There's some nitric acid, and there's some silver. It's sparingly sensitive to light, so you have this jar with a barrier around the outside, and when light goes through the stencil, it then darkens the chalk that is facing the glass on the inside of the jar. And this is where Schulze contributes to the evolution of photography, is that he's proving that this is done by light and not by heat. Thomas Wedgwood was the son of...
All right, so some of this stuff we'll get into later on, but that was sort of nice to see kind of how the physionotrace works. They went into discussing the silhouette a little bit and then actually jumped ahead of us into the camera obscura. So let me get back to our slideshow here. Right, so the silhouette was a big deal because it was accessible, right? You didn't have to be wealthy to get a silhouette. Anyone could do it. There was a big sort of divide between the sort of 1% who's very wealthy that can afford to commission a painter to do portraits, and then everyone else. So while everyone wanted to have some sort of likeness of their loved ones or of themselves to share with other folks, it wasn't feasible around this time unless you had a friend who could draw, who was an artist, and not many people had just someone hanging around who was an artist. So the silhouette was a really nice economical approach to sharing one's likeness. And so this is the one that's shown in your book. I'm sure you've all seen these before, but these have been happening for hundreds of years, and the Physianotrace was the tool that made it happen. So as we saw in the video, we have this drawing aid, which had the most direct influence on photography, and that's, again, called the camera obscura. As they mentioned in the video, it really is a dark room, and it started off being very large, very much like the one you see here, and wasn't always built outside. This one, I think, is showing a unique situation just as a diagram so you can understand how it works. But some folks would just build them in their homes, or if they had a large estate, they might have a work area that they used to build their camera obscura there. But it did start off being this big, which seems crazy, but that was, everything kind of starts out big, right? If you think about the first computer, that was like the size of a huge building, and it does not even have a modicum of the amount of processing power as anything that we have today, but it starts really big, and then everything gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Same thing with telephones. They used to be these giant boxes with an earpiece separate from the mouthpiece, and then over time, while they move on to getting like installed on your wall or your countertop, they still have a cord. Then they move to getting cordless phones, and finally into cell phones as we kind of understand them today. So everything starts big and then gets small as it's finessed and developed. So in this room, you would put up your canvas on the wall, and then you would trace the image. So it did result in very stiff and formal images, so it wasn't like you were going to use the camera obscura to make your drawing and that was it. It was, again, was a drawing aid to kind of help you get the general gist of your surrounding areas, the most accurate representation, the most accurate foundation for you to build your drawing, painting, or print that you were going to make afterwards. So again, a tool to help you get everything in the right place and the right shape. This one, and there was one similar in the slideshow the video that we just watched. It's coming in from above, and this is really important because when you have it coming in from the top, then it's projected down on a flat surface. This one is round, and therefore, instead of, if it was on a wall, you might only be able to bring in like 2 or 3 people at a time. If it's a circle and it's flat, you can bring in a whole bunch of people to stand around that surface. And the purpose of that was because these were used as entertainment. So folks would come and pay to stand in your camera obscura and look at the mirrored image from the outside world. This was, equivalent to going to the movies, which we're in a time frame right now where they don't have movies yet because we haven't got to photography yet. So this is sort of the beginning of where photography starts and leads into moving images as well. Much further down the road, but the sort of aspect of it as entertainment starts right away. Just like any new thing, it's how can you monetize on it, and these folks were quick to jump on that. So that's the one for entertainment. And then, of course, finally they were made smaller and more portable so that they could be used inside one's home, or that it could be very easily carried around for traveling artists. This one here, you can see, while not tiny, it is definitely much smaller than a whole room. So this woman shown here can use it in her home, and this one also has the added benefits of a lens and a mirror that can flip her object upright so she's not drawing it upside down. So this would have been something that folks with a lot of money would have been able to use, purchase and then use in their home as sort of like a hobby. And that's another way that they're monetizing on this. They're building these smaller ones and selling them to folks to use in their home. And then, of course, I'm sure there's the sort of non-wealthy folks who are very savvy with building things that could probably build their own and didn't have to purchase one made. It wouldn't have been mass-produced at this time because we're not to the Industrial Revolution yet, but it would have been produced in a way that it would have cost a bit of money to get one of these in your home. Anyways, there are artists today that still use the camera obscura in their work. The one that I like to share is Abelardo Morel, and this is one of his images that he made of one of his camera obscuras. So this one's from a building in New York City, and you can see that it's upside down, so he's not using a mirror or a converting lens. He's using just a hole to reflect the image outside, upside down, inside. You can tell that because at the bottom of the room there's this white space which indicates the sky, and then as we go up in the room you can see sort of all the colored trees and then the green grass, and then moving to the ceiling I can't really tell what's going on up there, but this is done in New York, and that is a view of Central Park upside down there. So this is a really fun project to do at home, especially since we're all stuck at home now and we're probably looking for things to do. So if you have a small room, whether it's like a bathroom or a bedroom or a space that whoever, roommates, family, etc., wouldn't be bothered if you turned it into a camera obscura, all you really need is a room that has a window, and you just need to block out all the light and put a little hole in that window and then wait for it to happen. This is not obviously something required of you to do, but it's really fun to try. So I've got a little video here that shows you how to do it, and I'll have to go back to the screen sharing again to get it. Okay, here, making your own room with a view, or camera obscura.
Camera obscura is a dark room, any size, that has an opening looking out into the world. Through that opening, an upside-down image of the outside actually gets projected on the back of the room. It's a very simple physical process.
Pretty easy, right? And obviously there's endless videos on YouTube about how to do that. So if you're interested, it is fun. I do recommend it. If you do decide to make a camera obscura, please share with us what you did and how you did it, because I think that would be really fun for us all to look at together. All right, so here is a drawing from a camera obscura. This one's in your textbook, and it actually might be more readable in your textbook. This picture that I got here isn't very good. But it does give you an idea of the rigidity and mechanical nature of the line work that comes from doing a tracing in a camera obscura. Similarly to how if you did a tracing on a light box, like if you put a magazine out and a piece of tracing paper over the top and then you wanted to trace that design, it has a similar vibe as that. So I just like to share that there. The other drawing aid we have is the Camera Lucida, and it means light room. Camera meaning room, and lucida meaning light. And what this what this device is a rod with a glass prism. That's kind of the basics of it. And it would reflect the scene down onto the paper. Essentially, you can see this gentleman here has it connected by a clamp to his drawing table. And the lines shown in this engraving here, the ones that are going to the head, the middle, and the bottom of the statuette there that he's drawing, are indicating how you would sort of look into the prism sort of out and down at the same time. I know that sounds silly, like how can you look out and down at the same time, but I try to think of it as if you've ever used those Magic Eye books. I don't know how relevant those are for you guys, but if you Google it, I think you'll probably be like, oh yeah, I've seen those before. But the Magic Eye books, where you kind of have to like cross your eyes and look at it for a long time to see the picture behind all this wacky nonsense in the front. I feel like that's a similar way to how you have to look down and out through the Camera Lucida, and the image would then appear to be reflected on the paper, but it's kind of an optical illusion in that sense, and then you would trace it there. Here is a collection of Camera Lucidas, and I always like these where it's like, oh, here's the one from 1820, 1840, 1860, etc. You can see the development of them. And then I actually found a couple years ago, there's someone who's making like a more current version of it, so you can like probably go out and buy the modern version of this still if this is something that you're interested in and want to try using. I don't know how much it is, and I can't recall for the life of me where I found it, but I was surprised. I remember I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe someone thinks this is going to be a good investment here, but who knows. Again, the Camera Lucida is something that mostly travelers would use. Traveling artists, rather, if they were moving around a lot. This was a device that was very portable, unlike the Camera Obscura, which wouldn't lend itself too much, even in its smaller size, wouldn't lend itself to traveling very well. Here's an early advertisement for some different drawing aids. And this is, again, you can see that these images are all engravings. So this is how they would have been reproduced for newspapers and advertisements. And I have a video about the Camera Lucida. This one is actually quite quick, but it's nice to kind of get an idea of how it goes from drawing to painting and using this as an aid for that. So let me get to it. Using the Camera Lucida.
Coffin's Beach is fairly close by. It's in Gloucester, Massachusetts. There's a drawing of the same subject by Lane in another local institution. But the thing that we noticed is that the drawing also has what we thought were mechanical-looking lines. And those lines led us to investigate the possibility that Lane was using a mechanical device called a Camera Lucida. And we found a 19th century Camera Lucida, and we went up to Gloucester, and we found the actual rocks that you see in the painting, and we were able to replicate the drawing. When you're looking into a Camera Lucida, it's kind of like a prism, and you look down and sort of out at the same time, and you see the landscape in the distance actually reflected down on a piece of paper in front of you. Now, by using a mechanical device, people often think that that means he's cheating. And that is not, in fact, what he's doing. He is actually using it as an aid for his topography. Because if you look at his drawings, they're very plain, they're very simple, and not particularly beautiful. And then you look at the painting and you see all those beautiful colors. You see all the pinks and the purples. That's the artist. That's what makes this such a beautiful painting.
Super basic, right? Just a nice little way to see how that sort of works. I'm going to get us back to our slideshow now. Bear with me. Okay, so in looking at these different types of drawing aids, there's kind of two categories. There's those like the Camera Lucida that help produce like a single image, and those like Physianotrace that you could, or the Physianotrace or the Pantograph really, where you could make, you know, multiple copies of the same thing over and over and over by tracing the subject. That's important because when we get into talking about how photography was invented, it was invented by a lot of different people, and we'll get into that more down the road, but some of them would create systems of photography that would make a very unique single image, something that could not be reproduced. And others would find ways to make multiple copies of their photographs. So we'll dive into that soon here, because we're now officially moving into the invention of photographies, and because of what I just mentioned, photographies make sense because there's more than one version that kind of evolves at the very beginning here. So this is Niepce, and he developed a precursor to photography which he called sunwriting. But before he did this, he started looking at the potential of something called lithography. It's another printmaking process, and similar to the woodcut and the engraving, it would make multiple images, but this time we weren't using a block of wood, we weren't using a copper plate, we were using a stone. And lithostone is what I've titled this slide, but it's kind of redundant because litho means stone, so I'm essentially saying stone. But anyways, this is a lithography stone, and it was different because you weren't etching into it like you are with engraving, and you're not cutting into it like you are with a woodcut. It differs in that sense, and I'll get into that in a second. But it also made a large number of prints. It renders the tones and the shadows much more subtly than etching and engraving and wood cutting. And again, to emphasize, there's no cutting into the stone. But this was important because lithography was important because there was a chemical reaction used to etch the images into the stone. Whereas with engraving and wood cutting, you're not using any chemistry. And chemistry is one of those ingredients that I mentioned at the beginning here that was essential to making photography work. And not just chemistry in general, but very specific combinations of chemistry. So before we talk about how this influenced Niepce, we're going to take a look at what lithography is. And it's again going to be quite similar to the overall process that we saw with the engraving and the wood cutting, but I think it's important that we see the differences and just be able to visualize this process. So let me get that lithography one. And this guy has a little bit, he's in Edinburgh, so he has a little bit of an accent. So if you need to go back and watch this again, I completely understand.
Lithographs can have a wide range of qualities. Some have the character of drawings, while others may be more painterly, being built up with layers of colour. Lithographic plates bring additional possibilities to the medium, allowing for larger scale prints and photographic and digital images to be produced as lithographs. While the principle of lithography is simple, the possibilities are endless. The materials and techniques used in the process offer many new marks and ways of working to add to the artist's palette. In stone lithography, the blocks of fine-grained lithographic limestone are prepared by graining two stones together with different grades of carborundum grit. With larger stones, a lithogator disc may be used with grit. Grinding removes the top surface of the stone, removing the previous image, and prepares a fresh, clean surface ready for a new image. Care must be taken during stone graining to ensure that the stone surface is flat and level to ensure the stone will print evenly. Larger blocks can be heavy, so using a lift trolley and roller shells eases handling. Proper shells protect the stone's edges from being chipped during storage. Once the stone is prepared, the image is usually drawn directly onto the stone surface using a special kind of waxy ink known as tuche. The tuche comes in crayon and liquid form, so a wide range of marks can be made. One of the main characteristics of stone lithography is its ability to allow the artist a direct approach to making marks on the stone. This directness allows the artist to treat drawing on the stone in the same way as drawing directly on paper, with the flexibility to lighten and remove marks by scraping, and then add further marks with ink. The liquid tuche can be diluted to create painterly effects similar to watercolour. When applied wet, it can create wonderful textures known as reticulations. There are a number of other approaches to making images on the stone. In this case, the stone has been covered with ink. Then, grit is used to rub the ink off to create light areas on a dark background. Alternatively, images can be transferred to the stone using photocopy or laser printouts, transferred with a solvent, allowing photographic or digital images to be printed from stone. After transferring, the image can be further manipulated with tuche crayon or ink to enrich the image. Once the image is completed, the stone is processed so that it can be printed. A coating of talc is applied to the drawing, followed by a coating of gum arabic. The gum arabic coats all the areas of the stone which are not already covered with ink, sealing the stone with a thin coating. Once the gum arabic coating has been left to dry, the ink is washed away with solvent and replaced with an oilier printing ink. The stone is then sponged with water, which lifts the oily ink from the white areas of the drawing. The stone is kept damp with a sponge while it is inked up with stiff oil-based printing ink. Throughout the inking process, the water acts as a barrier. It is through this opposition of oil and water that lithography works. Having inked the stone several times, the oily ink stains the stone more deeply, making the image more durable, ready for printing. At this point, further changes can be made to the drawing, either removing ink by scraping or using mixtures of gum and acid to lighten or remove marks. Before printing, a further coating of gum arabic mixed with acid is applied and allowed to dry while preparations are made for printing. Special stiff oil-based printing ink is mixed to the desired colour and then stiffened with the addition of magnesium carbonate powder. The ink is spread on the glass slab and rolled out with the printing roller to a thin, even thickness. Then, the black ink is washed off, replaced with colour ink, before sponging with water, and the stone is inked while the stone is kept dampened with water and a sponge. This cycle of sponging and inking is repeated several times to allow the ink to build up gradually on the image, ensuring that all the tone and subtlety of the image is retained. Once fully inked, the paper is placed on the stone and run through the press under high pressure to transfer the ink to the paper. The next print is then taken by repeating this cycle of sponging and rolling up the stone with ink several times for each print. Multicolour prints are usually produced by creating a separate image on stone for each colour to be printed. This may be done by using several stones, or alternatively, by cleaning the stone after each colour to prepare it for the next colour. When working with several stones, an outline of the composition may be traced onto the stone as a guide. The paper and stone are marked so that each colour will be aligned correctly. Inks can be mixed to be transparent, so they mix with the colours previously printed. This process of layering can be used either to produce a number of identical prints in a limited edition, or to produce several unique prints with different colour qualities. Blended rolls with more than one colour can also be used.
Okay, so you can kind of see the difference between that lithography process and the others that we've looked at. Again, the lithographic process, you could do almost endless copies. There's no deterioration of the stone ever. It's really all rooted in the chemistry and the inking process that you saw him go through. And I like that video because it shows you some of the more modern ways of using lithography, because I mean, looking at this stone here, you're like, oh my god, this is so old and boring, but it's actually not. It's very interesting, and artists still use it today. So what's the point of lithography? Well, Niepce was experimenting with lithography and the potential of it, but he wasn't very good at drawing. And so then he decided that he would experiment with chemistry, specifically light-sensitive materials and chemistry. After many, many experiments, he takes a metal plate that's coated with a specific mixture of chemicals into his camera obscura. He exposes the plate for about 8 hours, and then he washes it with this mixture of lavender and petroleum oil. The resulting plate had this negative that you see here. The image is reversed from left to right, and when he exposed the plate to iodine fumes instead of the image reversing to a positive, you know, sort of how we would think like a negative to a positive would work, it actually created greater contrasts. So this image is inverted in two senses, but this is what we would call a direct positive. And by now you've probably learned that anytime I have something in blue, it's going to be a video, but this one just is blue. There's no video here. So direct positive is a photograph without a separate negative from which to print copies. So it cannot be reproduced. There is only one, and it's on a metal plate, so you can't turn that into any other sort of negative at this time. And even though this is not completely stable, the image is not totally stable, it is considered to be the world's first permanent photograph, and it's called View from the Window at Grasse from 1826. And it's still around today. It's housed in an oxygen-free case at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas. So if you ever are in Austin and you want to go see the first permanent photograph, it's there. You might want to call ahead and make sure that it's out for viewing, but it is there and it does exist. So this was his heliography, or sun writing. Next, I want to talk about this gentleman here. His name is Daguerre. Niepce met Daguerre while he was traveling through Paris. And Daguerre was known as a painter, a designer of stage sets for theater, and he was a co-proprietor of something called the Diorama. Now, if you're like me, you're like, oh, diorama, that's like the little shoebox thing I made when I was in 3rd grade to represent, you know, something in my world history class. Yes, that is a diorama, but dioramas in the 19th century and dioramas that Daguerre was working on were very different. They were a very distinctive kind of theater that presented realistic special effects to sort of thrill the audiences. If you think about the types of entertainment we've already looked at, like the camera obscura showing the image flat down so many folks could come and see, the portable camera obscura to have in your home, things like that. Folks during the 19th century and earlier were monetizing off of very different things than we do now, but they're all related and they all led up to what we have today. So the diorama is basically a large-scale installation that uses a lot of staging illusions, impressions of very deeply recessed space, and he and Daguerre would use the camera obscura to create these very realistic paintings. And you can see in the slide here, there's two different versions of it. Both are the same, but under different lighting, it would change. So people would pay to go and see these very dramatic, thrilling installations that Daguerre would make that are called the diorama. So Niepce had met Daguerre in Paris, and Niepce and Daguerre agreed to this trade. So Daguerre was going to give Niepce a better camera obscura that would create much clearer images, and Niepce was going to share with Daguerre his methods for fixing photographs. And that word fixing is important because earlier when I was saying that the view from the window at Gras is the first permanent photograph, that means it's the very first one that was fixed that won't fade away. There's this process within all pre-digital photography where once you have your photographic print, you have to put it through a series of chemicals. And some of those chemicals are to develop the image, some of them are to stop the development, and then finally there's ones to fix the image. So if you take your print out of the chemistry before you fix it, the paper has been treated with light-sensitive chemicals. So if you bring it into light, the light is going to keep activating the silver crystals in that paper or that plate that you're using, and it will eventually just fade away. So fixing is the term we use for making a photograph permanent. And that's what Niepce was going to share with Daguerre. Of course, Niepce suddenly dies, and then Daguerre takes up all of his research. And there's a lot of speculation about that, and I always like to come up with these sort of wild fan fiction things about, like, oh, what really happened between Niepce and Daguerre, but there's nothing scandalous as far as we know. So anyways, in 1835, Daguerre experimented with Niepce's materials, which were silver plates, alternatively silver-plated copper plates, and iodine. And the reason that we have two different types of plates is because silver is expensive. So is copper, for that matter. But copper was a little bit more accessible than silver. So you could work with solid silver plates, or you would work with a copper plate and then coat it with silver, so that it wasn't as expensive. So what Daguerre was up to here is he was in search of something called the latent image, which is an image that had been registered on the silver surface of a plate but was not visible yet. Daguerre realized that treating the plate after it had been exposed could, effectively bring out this latent image. So Niepce had started with a visible image and then treated it with the iodine fumes, which made the image have a greater contrast. But Daguerre found that if there was a latent image on the silver plate and he treated it instead with mercury fumes instead of iodine, it would further develop the image, making it visible. And then he found that a solution, a very simple solution, table salt dissolved in hot water, that would stop the light-sensitive material from continuing to react, and then he had a stable image. So the table salt in water was different than the lavender and petroleum oil that Niepce was using. Also, the mercury was different from the iodine that Niepce was using. And once Daguerre got this far with his chemicals, he decided to call his stable images the daguerreotype. And of course, named after himself, right? Because that's what white men do, name things after themselves. So we have the daguerreotype. Some people pronounce it daguerreotype, but I think daguerreotype is the proper pronunciation of this word. So to make a daguerreotype, you would take a copper sheet that was plated with silver and polish it so it was very shiny, no blemishes, no dust, no nicks, no nothing. And then you would put the plate with the silver side down over this box, which had iodine fumes in it, and you would close it. And the fumes, the iodide fumes, would fuse with the silver to create silver iodide. And those of you who've taken chemistry classes before will know that silver iodide is light sensitive. Then you would be able to take your plate, put it in your camera obscura, open the lens, and expose it to light. Niepce's exposure time was 8 hours. And of course, today, almost 200 years later, we have almost no limitations on how quick the lens can go, the shutter speed can go. So in between there's all different time lengths, but the sort of early exposure times after Daguerre had developed this method a little further were about 4 to 5 minutes. So you can imagine that's a very long time, 4 to 5 minutes to sit for a portrait or to wait to make an image. Anyways, after you've exposed it for this 4 to 5 minutes, the plate with its latent image would be put into a different box that had the mercury fumes in it. And the mercury fumes would blend with the silver to then produce a visible image. At this time, the plate is still light sensitive and would react to light. So you would have to put it into that solution, table salt and water to stop the response, and then you would rinse it with plain water, and voila, you would have your daguerreotype. Here is a great engraving that kind of shows your daguerreotype kit that you would have if you were working as a daguerreotypist. And I do have a video that shows us the process. I think I'll show you that before I go into talking about what Daguerre was up to next. So let's, it's again nice to visualize, and they actually show you the whole process in this video, which is pretty great. So let me get to that for you guys. Hang on. Oh, that's not the right button. Okay, so here we go. Here's Daguerre.
On Monday afternoon, August 19th, 1839, the French Academy of Science held a special meeting to publicly disclose the formula for making daguerreotypes. The technique's inventor, Louis-Jacques Daguerre, had sold his formula to the French government so that it could be made freely available to the public without patent restrictions. The new medium seized the public's imagination. Daguerreotype mania swept through Paris and across Europe. All who saw daguerreotypes for the first time were equally impressed. Viewers took them to be completely faithful depictions of nature. As quickly as railroads and steamships could travel, news of the invention spread around the world. Nowhere was the daguerreotype more popular than in America, a young democracy and a mecca of progress. The daguerreotype studio attracted a wide cross-section of Americans. People from all walks of life could now afford to have their portraits made, and they did. For all their popularity, producing daguerreotypes was a labor-intensive process, requiring a lot of equipment and skill. The daguerreotype plate is made of copper faced with silver. To secure it and make it easier to handle, the plate is placed silver side up on an adjustable block. In order to prepare the plate for exposure, it has to be polished. In this modern demonstration of the daguerreotype process, the daguerreotypist applies a small amount of white powder, called rottenstone, to a cloth moistened with dilute alcohol. The daguerreotypist applies the alcohol and rottenstone to the surface of the plate using a consistent motion. The daguerreotypist sprinkles a fine red powder known as rouge onto a long padded stick. The plate plate is then buffed using the rouge. Polishing the plate in the same direction improves viewing of the highly reflective surface. The plate is then buffed a second time with a clean padded stick in order to increase its reflectivity. It is now ready to be light sensitive. In the dark, the daguerreotypist places the polished plate face down in a sensitizing box, which contains a small amount of iodine crystals. In about 15 to 45 seconds, fumes from the iodine react with the silver, coating the plate with silver iodide. This process would then be repeated with fumes from bromine, or quickstuff. From the sensitizing box, the daguerreotypist removes the plate, now coated with bromo iodide of silver. The plate is now light sensitive and ready for use in the camera. The daguerreotypist places the light sensitive plate in a plate holder with a coated side down. It is then secured into place. The viewing glass is lifted out of the camera and replaced with the loaded plate holder. The dark slide is removed to make the plate accessible for the exposure. To make the exposure, the daguerreotypist removes the lens cap. Early exposure times were notoriously long and sometimes uncomfortable, often taking more than 20 seconds. To ensure that the sitter did not move during the exposure, an 1840 Boston newspaper recommended the following.
His head should be placed on a semicircle of iron fitted to the back of the chair. His arms may be arranged at pleasure. He should fix his eyes on some well-defined object in any direction which he may prefer. Now, if everything is arranged as it should be, your portrait will often be made even in less than 20 seconds and in the most satisfactory manner.
In the dark, the daguerreotypist develops the plate. A few ounces of liquid mercury are very carefully poured into a flaring iron vessel, heated by an alcohol lamp. The exposed plate is removed from the plate holder and placed face down in the mercury chamber, which is heated to approximately 175 degrees Fahrenheit. After mercury vapor reacts with the sensitized silver, the daguerreotypist removes the developed plate. The daguerreotypist then fixes the plate, making it safe for viewing in normal light by pouring on it a solution of hyposulfite of soda. This removes the excess bromo iodide of silver not acted upon by light in the camera. After it has been thoroughly washed, a gilding stand is used to finish the plate. A weak solution of fluoride of gold is gently heated over an alcohol lamp. This hardens the plate and adds to the beauty and permanence of the image. After a final cleaning of the plate, the daguerreotype is assembled for safekeeping and display. The plate is put into a shallow hinged case that includes a decorative mat and preserver, both of brass, and a glass cover with taped edges. Daguerreotype studios presented their wares in a variety of cases, ranging from simple leather or cloth-covered wood to elaborate examples of inlaid mother-of-pearl and molded thermoplastic. Their assembly was an example of industrial age production. The work was often done by women and children, as in this factory, one of the largest of its kind. It is estimated that by the mid-1850s, in the United States alone, approximately 3 million daguerreotypes were produced annually, representing a retail industry of $7.5 million. In 1849, an American author concluded,
In our great cities, a daguerreotypist is to be found in almost every square. It is hard to find a man who has not shadowy faces of his wife and his children done up in morocco and velvet among his household treasures.
Okay, so that is the gist of how the daguerreotype is made. You can see that, I hope that you could tell from that image that they kind of have this mirrored surface to them. They're very otherworldly and ethereal looking images. I have one. If I don't remember to show it to you guys during our touch bases, remind me. It's literally right up there on a shelf. So I have a really nice one that I'd like to share with you. But sometimes it's hard to tell on a screen what a daguerreotype actually looks like. And if we're going to try to compare it to other types of photography, it's really important to see like why that one in particular was so different from the others. So Daguerre comes up with this process. He's super excited. It's successful. He does it. He's sort of won. And so he partners with Niepce's son Isidore to try to market this process. And they're trying to do it sort of by subscription or to get investors to get this off the ground. And he kind of failed at first because Daguerre had a reputation for creating these optical illusions with the diorama, and because folks knew him for creating those optical illusions for the entertainment world, that they were really suspicious of his methods, and they didn't believe him that this was a real thing. You can imagine after hundreds and hundreds of years of this photography not existing, all of a sudden someone saying, no, it's real and it works and I have proof, you might be like, oh my gosh, no, this is the work of the devil, it's going to steal my soul, something like that. There's all kinds of old theories about photography and soul capturing and things like that. But Daguerre had been trying to sell the art of the daguerreotype to what we would call the leisured class of the time. And what that means, leisured class, whatever your pronunciation preference is, they had a lot of money. They didn't necessarily have to work. They had time on their hands to experiment with these types of things. And so that's who he was after to try to get to buy it from him. And at the same time that Daguerre is trying to sort of peddle this invention, he's also going out and talking to very prominent artists and scientists so that they might endorse his process. And that was important because if the public wasn't going to trust Daguerre, then if he could get these artists and scientists that were trusted to say, hey, this works, and I've used it and it's great, then the public would trust him too. And throughout all of this, there's this astronomer and politician called Francois Arago, and he saw the daguerreotype and decided, okay, this is incredible. We need to talk to the French government and get funding for this process. So the French government at the time would support scientists and artists as a very important part of French intellectual life, and so they were going to provide funding for Daguerre's project. And Arago suggested that the government provide both Daguerre and Niepce with pensions, so money forever essentially, and that the new process of the daguerreotype would then be presented to the world by France. So saying that is very prestigious, like you're announcing this brand new, never seen before invention, and it's come out of your country, you're very proud, and it's going to change the world. So they were very excited about this. And so they make the announcement, and of course, after Daguerre announced his invention, we have records of about 24 other people claiming to have also invented photography. So essentially, they were all doing very similar experiments around the same time as Daguerre was. And we have to always put ourselves in the mindset of the 19th century, so the 1800s and early 1800s too. There's no phone, no radio, no television. You can send letters by post, but it's going by horse because we don't have cars, so it's going to take a long time. So communication is very much slower, and awareness of what other people are doing is not like it is today. Like today, if you were doing a project and you went online and Googled to see if anyone else was doing it, you'd find out right away to see what was similar. Or someone would see what you're doing and be like, oh my gosh, I know someone who's doing the same thing. Because we're constantly connected at all times. But, you know, just 200 years ago, that was certainly not the case. So that's what we have records of, right, is those 24 people. Who knows how many others who might not have even heard of Daguerre's announcement, or were in areas that were so far away from this communication that it, never reached them, So it's important to note that the things that we talk about in this class, and likely many of your classes, this is based off of the data and the information that we have access to, right? If someone hasn't recorded something or written it down, or even like if they have but it's not been made accessible to me as your educator, then I don't have a way to share that with you. So just remember that there might have been many, many more folks who invented photography as well, but we just don't have a written record of that. So that said, one of them in particular that I really like is Hippolyte Bayard. And everyone was so curious about this daguerreotype process. So anyone who had kind of a background in light-sensitive chemistry or materials they started to try to experiment and try to figure out Daguerre's process before all the details were released to the public. And he eventually came up, Hippolyte Bayard eventually came up with another paper process that created single individual prints, so direct positives, that could not be used as negatives and could not be made into multiples. So he was using a thick paper, not a copper plate or a silver-plated copper plate. He's using a paper process at this point. But again, it's creating a direct positive. So to backtrack a little bit, Niepce's first permanent photograph was a direct positive, but it was inverted. Daguerre's daguerreotype is a direct positive and cannot make multiples from it. And the same thing with Bayard. Paper process, direct positive, cannot make multiples. So Bayard develops this paper process, and he brings it to Francois Arago, and being hopeful that he can share in some of Daguerre's success. And of course, Francois Arago is very wary of having another inventor, because he doesn't want to ruin the sort of specialness and excitement about the daguerreotype, and he doesn't want to complicate anything either. So what he decides to do is he goes to the French government and he secures some funds so that Bayard could continue his experiments, but he tells Bayard not to tell anyone about it. So essentially he's been able to give Bayard money, but it's hush money. So like, here, go work on your little art project, but don't tell anyone that you're doing something similar. Which, you know, Bayard's like heartbroken over, but he's still like gonna take the money and go and work on his project. And because France was basically ignoring him in favor of Daguerre's photographic process, Bayard starts to make these very creative and dramatic photographs, particularly these self-portraits like the one you see here, where he's feigning death by suicide. He calls it Portrait of a Drowned Man, and that's him in the image there. And I mean, Bayard was such a drama queen, and I love him for it, but you know, it's one of those things where he also should have been recognized along with anyone else who came forward, and you know, but it was a different time and whatnot. So Bayard did not receive the same celebrity as Daguerre, but he did continue to make his self-portraits, and they were really revolutionary at the time. They tease the viewer a little bit into thinking about what could be represented by photography and what could not. If you think about even just here, let me go back to it. This is a standard portrait, right? This is what most folks would go and have done by a daguerreotypist at their photographic studio back in the day. You would also see photos of landscapes and documenting collections and monuments and all of those things. But it doesn't really start to expand into an art form until later on. Right now it's this like invention, this science, this craft, and it develops into art later on. But Bayard was one of the first to use it very artistically, like right around the time that it was launched. And you can see here that his photograph actually kind of looks like a painting. And that's going to be something really important to remember throughout the entire term, is the relationship between photography and painting, which we'll go into more depth on, but it will come up over and over and over again. But you can see in this particular image the way that Bayard's placed himself, the placement of that hat on the wall, the way the image is framed, everything about this is very similar to how one might structure the layout of a painting of a similar portrait. So just keep that in mind, and don't forget about this relationship between photography and painting, and how I'm expanding too much. We'll talk about it more later. Next, we have John Herschel, and he was based in Britain, also experimenting with photographic chemicals, and he was working with a chemical called hypo, which is actually still used today in the development of black and white analog photography, so darkroom photography. And he's also working with reactions of platinum salts. Herschel very quickly successfully fixed images and made negatives that could be used to make multiple prints. Now, this is different than what Bayard, Niepce, and Daguerre had been able to do, right? You heard me just go through that list saying that despite the differences and nuances with their processes, every single one of them could only make a direct positive image. So images that could not then create multiples from. Herschel, on the other hand, figured it out, and he was sort of a Renaissance man. So he's not only a scientist, but he's an astronomer and an artist and a thinker and a theorist. The list goes on and on. But he was more of the type who was like, oh, I just want to see if I can do it. He didn't want like the fame or fortune that Daguerre was sort of going for, that Bayard was disappointed he didn't get. Herschel was just like, okay, cool, I did that. So he figures out how to make multiple images from photographic negatives, and then he's like, okay, cool, done, next thing. And of course, once you've been able to make a black and white image, your mind is like, okay, color, right? So obviously we don't get color photography until we get Kodachrome in the early 20th century. So we know that this doesn't quite work out the way that he had hoped. However, Herschel continued to mess around with these different vegetable dyes, similar to dyes that would be used to color fabrics, and his hope was to create color photography. And as we know, that was unsuccessful, but there was one thing that did work. He used iron salts to create a process that he called the cyanotype. It's a deep Prussian blue and white prints, similar to a process called sun printing, which those of you who kind of dug into that, it was optional reading and optional watching from last week, but those of you who did look at what that is, it's very similar to that. So the process of the cyanotype was super simple, to the point that it had the potential to make everyone a printer and a publisher, and really showed the democratic potential of photography. This is like, the cyanotype is like the Instagram of early photography, right? Everyone can use Instagram. Instagram allows everyone to be a photographer or brand themselves in whatever way they choose. That's the sort of access that everyone has to Instagram is similar to how the cyanotype was accessible to many, many people. Due to the simplicity, it didn't involve a ton of chemicals. It didn't involve a complex fixing agent. It really just needed the treated paper, light, and water. Very simple. It never became a major form of photography, but it did have commercial success with amateurs, scientists, and those who would kind of use it to make specimens and test prints of things. Before we watch the video about it, eventually the cyanotype was employed by architects and was used to make their blueprints. So the way this was done is they would treat the paper with the chemistry, that the chemical agent to make it light sensitive, then they would take their architectural drawing, which was likely done on a thinner tissue paper or tracing paper, lay it over the top of the treated paper, put it in the sun, and then any area that had lines on it would block the sun, and the sun would turn everything else blue. So that was the early type of architectural blueprints. Today they have, you know, more digitized versions of that, but that was how it worked back then. So let's now watch how the cyanotype works, and I think hopefully that'll help you understand a little bit more what I'm saying about like how easy and simple and accessible it was. And access is so important when we're talking about photography, because so much of art had been inaccessible to so many people before this, and now, you know, we have already something that's, photography itself is more accessible and democratic than anything that came before. So here, let me make sure this is, okay, yes, it's working. Here is about the cyanotype.
Sir John Herschel was the scientific superstar of the 19th century. Herschel is the man who could have invented photography if he'd been bothered to. He's the one that Talbot goes to find out how to fix his images permanently. And as Herschel is dabbling, he invents the cyanotype as well.
Sir John Herschel was an astronomer and scientist, and working around the same time as Talbot in England. Once he heard about the invention of photography, he decided to figure it out for himself, and he came up with the cyanotype process.
Herschel invented the process after Daguerre had already announced his own process, after Talbot had announced his process. Cyanotype is a very interesting process. It's a non-silver process. Most of the photographic processes used throughout the 19th and 20th century are silver-based. Herschel comes up with a process that produces a permanent blue and white image based on the salts of iron. And while there are many variants of the process, essentially it's two chemicals. You take potassium ferrocyanide and ferric ammonium citrate, and when you combine these two chemicals, you produce a compound that if you brush this on paper and allow it to dry, put them in contact with your negative, place them in the sun, it will turn color when it's exposed to light. And so it's kind of a latent image process. There are elements of printing out, because you actually see a printed out image on the paper, but it really comes to life when you put the paper into just plain old water. It turns bright blue. It doesn't get much use in the 1840s, with the exception of maybe botanicals.
It was utilized very early on by a British woman who was the daughter of a friend of Herschel's named Anna Atkins.
She was doing a record of botanicals that were placed on this paper as a way of keeping a record without having to draw.
She then published several series of books of botanical specimens, and those are really the first photographically illustrated publications. It gives you this really rich blue, intense color. I think it sort of takes it out of the vernacular, takes it out of everyday life, and makes us look at it a little bit differently.
Cyanotype is invented by Herschel in the very beginning of photography, but really doesn't see any use until the end of the 19th century.
It started being used in engineering applications. It became what we now know as the blueprint.
The blueprint really found its way all the way into the 21st century. The other way of using the cyanotype process was to make very cheap photographs from gelatin silver negatives.
It was utilized by many photographers to do test prints or contact sheets as a proofing material.
The most common cyanotype you'll find are the images that are made by college students in the 1880s, 1890s.
So most of these cyanotypes that we see in collections tend to be done by amateurs.
All right, so that was the cyanotype. It's pretty cool, right? So again, very similar to the Sunprint. For those of you who didn't look into what the Sunprint is, essentially you can buy these kits, Sunprinting kits. There's several different brands. They're available online as well as in craft stores. Again, different brands, different sizes, but it's basically pre-treated paper. So you don't have to mix the chemistry, you don't have to brush it on the paper. You can order the paper ready-made, and essentially what you do is you just take out the paper, lay objects on top of it, and you take it out into the sun. And then depending on which brand of, sorry, I'm trying to get back to our slides here. Depending on which brand of sun printing paper you buy, they'll take different amounts of time in the sun. And also you can experiment with, you know, if you leave it out longer, what happens? If you leave it out shorter, what happens? But when you're done in the sun, you basically take it and put it in water. I usually run it under cool water, you know, for a minute or so. And then you let it dry and you have this beautiful print. And it's really easy and really fun. So again, maybe before it gets to be wintry, that's something that you all want to play around with. Again, it's not mandatory. It is something that I usually do with the class when we meet in person. We go and do sun prints outside on the first or second day, but unfortunately we can't do that now. So if you're looking for things to do, I highly recommend the sun printing because it's cheap, accessible, and really easy. So let me know if you decide to play around with that because it is very fun. The next and sort of final topic for today is Henry Fox Talbot, and you saw him brought up in the previous video. So Talbot had been working on photo experiments since about 1833, and he'd had some modest success with those well before Daguerre had any provable results about anything. And so originally he had been working with the camera Lucida trying to create lines. Now, we've heard this story already. Niepce was trying to draw on stones and sucked at it, so he moved on to working with chemistry. Talbot was not good at drawing. He did not have a talent for it, so he gets rid of his camera Lucida and he starts experimenting with fixing images with his camera obscura. So he had played with a lot of different methods, and I'll tell you about a few of them here. So one was that he would darken a glass plate with candle smoke, and then he would varnish the surface so that the soot would stay in place. Then he would draw or write on the plates with some sort of stylus etching tool that would cut through the black coating, and he would set them over a piece of light-sensitive paper stock and put it out into the light. And then any of the lines that he had cut through the soot, those would be transferred to the paper. Sometimes this process is called cliché vert or glass picture. Additionally, he would sensitize all of his paper with silver nitrate and table salt. But instead of putting the paper into the camera obscura, he would place an object on top to be copied onto the surface, and sometimes he would put a piece of glass over it as well so that he could get a crisper edge on that botanical sample. With these early experiments, it would take anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes to make a print depending on how sunny it was and what time of day you were doing it at. But then he would bring the paper in, put it in that solution of hot water and table salt, and the image would be fixed and not fade away. This particular process of laying objects on paper was called the photogenic drawing. Alternatively, a light-caused drawing, or skiography, shadow writing. Prints like these are still made today, now in art classes or darkroom photography classes, they'd be called a photogram. So that's kind of where Instagram came from, if you were wondering. Because of the very strong salt component, the images would eventually be called salt prints, which he would eventually create using the camera obscura. So his photogenic drawings, those are cameraless photographs. He's not using a camera obscura. It's just the sensitized paper and the objects and the sunlight. The salt prints later on, those would be using a camera obscura to create the image. So in 1835, he did manage to make a picture after exposing his sensitized paper in a small version of his camera obscura. And then he realized that he could use his photogenic drawings as negatives to create a second photogenic drawing. So essentially, he would take this image here, lay it over the top of another piece of sensitized paper, put it in the sun, and anything in this image here that you see is white on the new image would render as the sort of gray, blackish tones, and the sort of cloudy black outside would be inverted as well. So we understand that to be something similar to what you see here. So after 1841, or in 1841, after he improved the capability of the photogenic drawings to make multiple copies, Talbot patented the process that he called the calotype. This comes from the Greek word for beauty, which is kalos, kalos, depending on your Greek pronunciation. So this was made using, it made use of the latent image on the negative from which many prints could be made. So this was, like what we talked about Herschel coming up with, completely unique from the daguerreotype. The daguerreotype was singular, and the calotype was essentially plural, but you could make endless copies from a calotype, whereas the daguerreotype was only one. So the calotype became the basis for modern photographic reproduction, and it's kind of exciting that we get to that. But I do have a video on Mr. Talbot if you want to watch here. So let's get to know him, and then we'll tidy this up for the day. So let me get to share screen, and we'll get Mr. Talbot up here. All right.
This time around the 1830s is really when photography comes together.
Daguerre is in France, making images with silver iodide on metal plates, and Talbot is working in England, making images with silver chloride on paper. Working simultaneously in two different countries, not quite knowing about the other. But that changes when you start to have articles in the press. Now it's public. And so a rivalry begins. William Henry Fox Talbot is a gentleman scholar in England living in an old abbey in the village of Laycock.
He was a member of the House of Lords. He was a wealthy individual who had many, many interests.
Talbot is on his honeymoon in Lake Como in Italy, and he's trying to make drawings with a camera lucida. He's trying to do pencil sketches, and realizes that he has no skill whatsoever in drawing. He wants to make pictures within a camera obscura. All he has to do is find the material that he can put into the back of the camera to record the image.
Finally, when he returns home to Laycock Abbey, he starts doing experiments, and he is able to produce a photographic image.
Talbot is making images by using silver chloride in the production of making what he called photogenic drawings, which are essentially just coating paper with salt, coating paper with silver nitrate, and place a fern or objects on top of the paper. Put a piece of glass on top of that and lay it in the sunlight. It will darken. Up to that point, it's not so much different than what Wedgwood did. But but Niepce and Wedgwood could not figure out a way to keep the drawings. What Talbot discovers is that if he takes that image and puts it into a stronger solution of salt water, all the areas that were not exposed to light, all the areas that didn't turn to metallic silver, become less sensitive. They are not removed completely, but he can show them to people in the house. You can see them by candlelight. This is the type of camera that Talbot used in his earliest experiments with photogenic drawing. Many of them are still around, and you can see them as long as you don't bring them out into too much light.
Usually when you see them, they're sort of under a piece of velvet, so it feels like this intimate experience of looking at a photograph in its first days. Now photography is so ubiquitous that we probably don't think about how special and magical that experience was.
Talbot is the first person to make a salted paper print. He actually invents something that's permanent. It's basically his photogenic drawing process that has been fixed with hypo. Sodium thiosulfate is the modern term. Its potential of removing silver halide is discovered by Sir John Herschel.
Salted paper prints, because of the way they're made, where the image material sinks into the paper, tend to have a less crisp look to them. There was sort of this dichotomy between the crisp, clean, almost three-dimensional quality of the daguerreotype and the softer, almost more granulated sensibility of the salted paper print. So that sort of got reduced to information versus artistry in the early years of photography's history.
Talbot improves the photogenic drawing process by switching from silver chloride to silver iodide, the same silver halide that Daguerre uses in his process. The latent image calotype process that he invents in 1840 allows him to make a little bit of an exposure, and then he develops out the invisible image to a visible image using gallic acid. And so now he can put this into a camera and actually do pictures of living human beings. He can then make photographic negatives, and after those negatives are fixed with hypo, he can then place those on top of a second sheet of sensitive paper, expose that to light, and now he makes a positive proof. So he has negative and positive. He essentially introduces the negative-positive potential for photography that becomes the standard of photography until the invention of digital photography. The rivalry between Daguerre and Talbot continues today. There are champions of Talbot and the champions of Daguerre. Both camps feel that their man invented photography. In fact, it's all photography, just a different type.
After Talbot figured out this negative-positive process, he wanted to show what photography could do. So his way to do that was to produce a series of publications called the Pencil of Nature. Pencil of Nature contains text explaining Talbot's process. It contains salted paper prints, mostly showing Talbot's home at Laycock Abbey, and each of the photographs is meant to display one of the various uses of photography. Talbot's showing the reproducibility of the photograph, which really became one of the most important aspects of the medium.
Okay, so that was the gist of Talbot there. So you can see how important it was that he was doing the negative-positive process. It really was the main way of making photographs until digital became affordable, accessible, and economical for everyone involved. So when Talbot and Daguerre and, really Talbot and Daguerre launched their calotype and daguerreotype processes, there's many books made, there's many presentations made sharing photography with the public. Even though photography had not been foreseen before 1839, there's a ton of uses for it that immediately spring up after it's been announced to the public. So just a few, and we'll go into these in much more depth in next week's lecture, but archaeological research and restoration, the camera itself and the method of photography starts to be employed as this objective retina to kind of assist in studying the properties of light. And then, of course, recording some art. We talked about this earlier, sculptures, paintings, etc. Specifically, a lot of 19th century archaeologists were very interested in Egyptian buildings. So that will come up over and over again throughout the text. But they're using photography to record these hieroglyphics to be studied by specialists. Francois Arago still wanted to cement Daguerre as the exclusive inventor of photography, but as we can see, there were many, many, many folks working on with the medium around the same time. And I can't emphasize enough how, we teach what we know and have access to. So there were likely even more people working on photography at the same time that we just don't have the historical records of. There's an exhibition in France that Arago tries to invite everyone to. He invites Herschel, he invites Talbot, he invites Bayard to come and see the daguerreotype exhibition, the launch, if you will. And Herschel goes, but Talbot does not. And I don't think this has anything to do with any animosity. I just think that Talbot likely didn't want to travel from Britain to France to see these daguerreotypes. And one final note, the daguerreotypes were certainly visually superior to the calotypes, but the essential thing they were lacking was the reproducibility that would really drive photography forward in the coming years. So that's what I want to leave it off today. Next week, I will see everyone for your touch bases. Please keep an eye out. If I haven't already sent you the schedule, keep an eye out for that. Again, if you have any questions at all, I'm always available during our class period, even when we're not having touch bases. So that said, thank you for listening to me talk on and on and on about photography, and I will see you next week. Take care.